Hey guys, I've got to take a little bit of time off to deal with some important things on the home front. And our team here at Pelican Plus is posting my greatest hits, let's call them, of some older videos that I've done, which may be new to you if you haven't seen them before. For those of you who are watching this on Substack and you are a paid subscriber, make sure that you click down underneath for the post explaining how to migrate over to Pelican Plus. And if you're someone who's never subscribed before, now's as good a time as any. There's a link down there for you as well. All right, enjoy the show. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. We're back with our They've Uncrowned Him book study following the works of Archbishop Lefebvre on the kingship of Christ in his seminal text, They Have Uncrowned Him. The first portion of the book was largely concerned with building the foundation for the teaching of the church on the kingship of Christ and the various condemnations by the popes over centuries and centuries of the type of liberalism that has become commonplace in our day, defining liberalism on the way, and so on and so forth. That was the first portion of the book. That was kind of more of the heavy lifting, if I'm going to be honest. Now we're transitioning into the second portion of the book, where Archbishop Lefebvre is going to bring us through essentially how this spirit infiltrated the church. Before it was sort of the background of how it kind of just came to be and what the popes were saying about it. And now it goes from there to a place of how did this enter into Catholicism and become liberal Catholicism, which ultimately leads us to the spirit of the Second Vatican Council and the errors that have emanated since the council and in the council in some cases. And we're going to get into that today. So the first chapter we're going to go over is called The Great Betrayal. And this is the betrayal of Catholicism mixed with liberalism. So I'll just pull that book up for you here. So here is chapter 15. And as you can see, it's called The Great Betrayal. And it begins with, to the Catholic doctrine of the social kingship of Christ, our Lord Jesus Christ, and the union between church and state, the liberals, claiming to be Catholics, object that it is doubtlessly true but inapplicable even in the Catholic countries. So what they're saying is that, yeah, the kingship of Christ is a true doctrine, but how are we going to do that? There's really no practical way to do that. And this turns into this notion that in theory, one can accept the thesis proposed by the popes and the theologians. In practice, one must yield to circumstances and place himself resolutely into the hypothesis to promote religious pluralism and the liberty of forms of worship. And there's a quote here that he has, and he says, "The liberal Catholics have not ceased responding that they have a will for orthodoxy equal to that of the most intransigent and a sole concern for the interests of the church. The conciliation that they have sought is not theoretical or abstract, but practical." So in essence, the idea here is the liberals are saying, oh, yeah, I believe in the church's teachings. Yeah, I'm not a heretic. I believe all these things, but really these are kind of ideals and there's really no way to practice it. So the way forward is to make a conciliation or a compromise with the modern spirit of the world and promote religious liberty in general. And we can have this ability to act freely. And many people believe this. I mean, you know, this is election season in the United States. Of course, all of these questions about religious liberty and so forth. And we've gone ad nauseum here. We've gone at it ad nauseum about the reality of religious liberty not being a Catholic principle. And there is a reality that, yes, if you live in a country where, well, for example, I'll give you an example. During the lockdown, Chris Ferrara of the Thomas More Society, I think it's called. It's a nonprofit First Amendment American law firm that deals with basically the rights of Catholics and so forth primarily. And the state in New Jersey, I think it was New Jersey, they weren't allowing Catholics to open up their churches, anyone really. So Chris Ferrara took them to task and they won a case actually. And of course, in that case, they had to appeal to the constitutional framework of the United States, appealing to religious liberty. That was the framework you had to use, of course. But I know Chris Ferrara. He's not a liberal, and he promotes this book, for example. He doesn't believe in religious liberty as a good principle, but he recognizes that living in the United States, one must, play in the game in order to get anywhere. That is different than the doctrinal practicality. Dealing with it practically on the ground of, I mean, there's no other way to open my church. This is the legal system I have. That's very different than we should teach this as something Catholics should promote and accept. There's a big difference there. We all understand that we live in a broken world and that our governments are crazy and that we have to go through certain things. And deal with philosophical, religious, and legal realities that we don't believe in order to be able to operate. But there's a difference between that and that system is actually a good thing that we should promote as a Catholic value. That's the important distinction that has to be made. And if we move on here, Archbishop Lefebvre expands on this kind of in the way that I did. And this is an important line here that I did not highlight, and I will now. And he says, he's talking about liberal Catholics, and he says, in short, they refuse to believe in the practical efficacy of the truth. And that's an important distinction as well, because while it is all well and good to say, in this instinct, I'm just a layman and I've got to deal with this legal framework, it's another thing for Catholic theologians to talk about it as if the doctrines themselves have to be quote unquote practical. This is a betrayal of the power of the truth. Christ says the truth will set you free. He doesn't say there's freedom in truth if you can have all of it, but you can't always. He says, no, the truth will set you free. There is efficacy in the truth. And this is a matter of courage and fortitude really on behalf of the hierarchs of the church and the prelates. You and I, we can't really do anything about this, can we? It's not like for example, if somebody said, Kennedy, I'd like you to run for parliament and I'd like you to run on the principles of Catholic social principles, on Catholic social principles, the kingship of Christ and so forth. There's no way I could ever, first of all, that's never going to happen here in Canada in this context, but there's no way that I could ever get anywhere without the support of the bishops. In theory, if all of the Catholic bishops of Canada were doing their job and all the people were catechized, and obviously there's never going to be perfect, but they were doing their job, and this was well-formed priests and Catholic action and so forth, then yeah, you could have a shot of getting 20, 30, 40% of the vote, considering there's about a third of the country is baptized Catholics in Canada when you include Quebec. But the point is that the prelates have compromised doctrinally. They're promoting the religious liberty rather than saying to their congregations, hey, we are, foreigners in a strange land where our nation isn't Catholic. So you're going to have to meander through the woods, the darkness, in order to live here. But this is what the church teaches, and we must hold strong and fast, and we will demand this for you when we have our negotiations with the government. That's what the bishops should be doing, and they're not. And this is why Archbishop Lefebvre calls this the great betrayal, because ultimately, this is the betrayal of the prelates of the church. They have betrayed you. They have. It's an intellectual sickness, as we'll see. It's a disease of the mind. That's actually the portion of the next chapter, I think, or the chapter after we're going to go through. And this liberalism, it renders men effeminate and feckless and ineffectual. Once you have lost the battle interiorly, once you have decided that the truth itself does not have its own power and its own rights that will be respected, once you've done that, you've lost. And this is why, Catholics should really watch how Marxists operate. They should really watch how the left sloganeers and claims its things. We know they're lying, but they say it as if it's gospel truth. They say abortion is healthcare. They say, trans rights are human rights. They say all these things, They teach you as if it's a fact that the Inquisition, that the Crusades, that the French Revolution, etc., were good. They teach it as if it's a fact. They say it as if it's a fact that there's no debating that before the 1960s sexual revolution, women were beaten up by their husbands every day and the world was a hellhole. They say those things as if it's a fact. And even though they're lying, the fact that they say them as factual truths with no compromise, people believe it. People believe it. It reminds me of the Gospels. Sorry for the loud trucks driving by. I'll try to edit the background noise out in post, so maybe you won't hear it. But if you do, my apologies. I'm in my sunroom. Windows are open. That's why I'm sweating a bit. It's kind of hot again here in September. And but you're calling the Gospels when they're walking with Christ on the way to Emmaus. I think it's the two apostles. And they say, were our hearts not on fire when he preached to us and opened up the scriptures, essentially. I'm paraphrasing, but I think it says open up the scriptures. When you tell the truth, it converts people. You just tell the truth. And in fact, if they martyr you and they kill you for it, it's because they recognize the fact that it's true and they have no argument, so they have to hurt you. The truth, there's that quote attributed to St. Augustine. I don't know if it's true, but the quote is, the truth is like a lion. All you have to do is set it free. I'm not sure if it's true, but there's a lot of wisdom in that. So if we return to the book, Cardinal Below, great cardinal of the early 20th century, late 19th century, couple small idiosyncrasies in Cardinal Below's work. He was someone who tried to advocate a doctrine of something like uncatechized pagans being like unbaptized infants, like grown-up infants, so they would not go to hell, but they'd go to the limbo of the fathers. It was a disputed question. So there's a couple things about Below that aren't perfect, but when it comes, and again, there's a lot of things about all of us that are not perfect, but I just wanted to get that out of the way, because I know that in traditional circles, some of his writings are a little controversial on that subject. But when it came to the kingship of Christ, second to none on the stuff that he wrote, and also his ecclesiology was exceptional. In any event, here's what Cardinal Below says of this mentality, of the fact that they refuse to believe in the practical efficacy of the truth. And he says the liberalism of the quote-unquote liberal Catholics escapes all classification and has only one sole distinctive and characteristic note, that of perfect and absolute incoherence. It's insanity. It's insanity. On the next page, you can see here, I have this quote here that I want to, or this passage I want to read at length because it's important. Archbishop Lefebvre says, there is also, I will come back to this in the following chapter, an intellectual confusion at the bottom of this error, a mania of kept up confusions, a refusal to define anything, such as this confusion between tolerance and tolerantism. Now that's a very important distinction, so pay attention to this. Tolerance is a Catholic principle and is under certain circumstances a duty of charity and of political prudence towards the minorities. Tolerantism is, on the contrary, a liberal error which grants to all dissidents indiscriminately and under all circumstances and in justice the same rights as the ones enjoyed by those who are in the truth moral or religious. Now, as can be observed in other realms, to make of charity a justice is to upset the social order. It is to kill justice and charity. So let's repeat that last line there. Now, as can be observed in other realms, to make of charity a justice is to upset the social order. It is to kill justice and charity. You could probably even say this kind of like the distinction between justice and mercy. People will advocate for the mercy of God, not realizing that the mercy of God is the justice of God. His justice is his mercy. Okay, everyone is owed perfectly what they're due. God knows the heart and gives it out perfectly. When you turn charity into justice, then you kill justice and charity. So the Catholic state, the Catholic principle is that there is a state with one religion. This is the 10 Commandments. You shall have no other gods before me, that sort of thing. This is obvious. This is so simple. I can't believe people, it shows that people don't even know their 10 Commandments. I mean, the notion of religious liberty is, have your foreign gods and your heresies with the one true faith having equal rights. It's like, that's catechism. That's 10 Commandments, literally 1, 2, and 3. 101, basically, right? 1, 2, and 3. 101, 201, and 301. Anyway, so by justice, there is no error has no rights. There is no rights afforded to error. So no false religion can have rights by justice. As a matter of charity, meaning the love we have for neighbor, we can say this is tolerated, but it has no rights in the positive sense. It has a permission, it has a privilege or something, but not a right. Because a right must be attached to a duty. Rights are attached to duties. So, for example, you have the right to work. because you have the duty to provide for your family. You have the right to property because you have the duty to have a dwelling for your family, etc. You don't have the right to a false religion because there's only a right associated with the true religion, because you have a duty by divine law to worship God in the proper manner, and you have a duty not to worship him in the proper manner. For the reasons of public peace, you cannot convert souls by force or anything like that, violence, etc. So for matters of public peace and the pluralism of certain societies, the Catholic state may say this thing is tolerated here, but it has no rights. So it can't be taught in schools. It can't be promoted through broadcasts and so forth. There's no right to public processions and things like that. It's something that you have as your thing. And the thing is, this is just true. It's not a fun truth for people that have grown up in a liberal society, but that's just the way it has to be. And again, this is something we all understand. Recently in the United States of America and in Canada, but it's been more publicized in the media in America, there have been controversies over the issues of teaching critical race theory, intersectionality, those sorts of things in public schools. And parents have risen up in droves, especially in red states, and have gone to their school boards. You've probably seen some of these videos, people talking about this at school board meetings and stuff. And they're like, you have no right to teach my kids that. You have no right to teach them that because it's not true. And they're basically just saying error has no rights. People understand that for things that they find odious, for things that they hate. But there's no hatred of error and heresy anymore, so they can't make that next step. But people understand this naturally. You understand that, no, you can't promote these things in the state to my children or whatever. Or, for example, even today in our depraved world, even places like Toronto, etc., completely depraved cities in many ways, there's still obscenity laws. You're not allowed to put nudity on billboards and stuff, which is kind of amazing that you can't at this point. I mean, considering how depraved and sinful the culture is. But there's this understanding that you don't have the right to make people see that. Well, you don't have the right to make people see heresy, which is worse than nudity, actually, because it's an offense against God. Not that nudity is good, but you know what I'm saying. So we got to follow these principles through. Everyone believes in these things. They just won't make the next logical step. And as I said, the left really believes in these principles, but they invert it completely. That's why they're good to pay attention to. Marxism is the ape of the church, right? That's exactly what it is. So yeah, the last point there, just to reiterate, when you turn charity into a justice, you no longer have justice and you no longer have charity. Okay, the next chapter here, I'll bring up my screen. And this is the liberal Catholic mentality. And Archbishop Lefebvre calls it a sickness of the mind. And it is. It's a sickness of the mind. The first quote here is, the first passage is, more than a confusion, liberal Catholicism is a sickness of the mind. The mind does not manage to repose simply in the truth. It's true, it's restless. The mind does not dare to affirm anything without the counter-affirmation immediately presenting itself to it, which it feels obliged to pose as well. Pope Paul VI was the type itself of this divided mind, of this double-faced being. This could be read on even physically on his face. It's true, if you look at old pictures of Pope Paul VI, he always looks like he's confused. Honestly, there's this confused, perplexed look on his face. Perpetually tossed about between contradictory things and enlivened by a pendulum movement oscillating regularly between tradition and novelty, and intellectual schizophrenia. And he uses a quote here from a priest, Father Clarissac. He says, it's a lack of integrity of the mind. Let's break that down just quickly here. So, integrity, what does it mean? Fullness. Things are in their right parts, in their right spot, doing the right thing. When you study Thomistic metaphysics, when you study realism and Platonic and Augustinian and Aristotelian, that tradition of realism, you get to the place where there's a complete integrity of the principles and of the ideas. So there is a system of surety with which you can assess the world in a correct manner. And this translates to religion when you have doctrines that have an assurity to them. And this leads you to the conclusions that leave no room for ambiguity. Christ says this to us. He says in the Apocalypse, he talks about how he'll vomit lukewarm. He vomits you out of your mouth, out of his mouth, if he's lukewarm. He would rather you be hot or cold, but he vomits you out of his mouth. You know, in the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, the one chapter about Father Spike, if you've read the book, you'll know what I'm referring to. And if you don't know the book, I recommend you check out the book. It's a great audiobook. The recording by Joss Ackland is the best. If you're a Canadian or a hockey fan, I guess it was more popular than just hockey fans, but the Mighty Ducks movies from the 90s. Joss Ackland played Hans, Emilio Estevez's Eastern European hockey mentor. Sentimental thing for all the Canadian kids, especially, that grew up loving those movies. In any event, Joss Ackland, great actor, great voice actor, and he read the story. And anyway, one chapter, the thing that happens in that book is that there's a senior devil trying to tempt a junior devil, and to make him a better tempter, to damn this certain person to hell they call the patient. And the senior devil is writing letters to the junior devil, and he's telling him what sorts of parishes, because this young man has had a conversion, and this devil's trying to meander through that to get him out of his conversion, to get him to come away from the faith. And he actually says there's certain places to avoid. Avoid the traditionally parishes, and avoid the ones with the sort of very politically activated priests as well. And he brings up this Father Spike, and he says this Father Spike is all over the place. One day he's talking about overthrow of the system. The next day he's talking about this. The next day he's talking about radical charity and things like that. But he says the problem with Father Spike is that he really believes. He believes in what he's doing really, really strongly. This is what Christ is telling us. He would rather us be hot or cold. Vomit he spits out of our mouth. He spits out of his mouth. Ambiguity is worse than error in a sense. This is why you look at history, look at all of these, and maybe you're one of them, all of these Marxists and Satanists and whatever, who become saints even in some cases. And like St. Augustine is one. St. Augustine was a Gnostic, and he was a philosopher, and he really believed in his Gnosticism and his anti-Catholic philosophy, and tried to defend it. And in trying to defend it as a fire-breathing anti-Catholic, he became the saint that he is, because he really believed. Ambiguity is worse. The whole, no, I don't care, whatever. Another part in the Screwtape Letters, which I recommend so much, it's a great book. This devil is saying, be careful what kind of sins that you get your patient to participate in. He says, you might think I'll get him to murder someone. Says, but the problem is that murder is such a great sin that he'll probably repent after and we'll lose him. Amazing how that works. Hot and cold, right? There's nothing ambiguous about murder. But he says, instead, tempt him to play cards, meaning tempt him to get a gambling habit. It's, why tempt him to murder when he'll probably repent, when cards will do over a long period where he just goes off into this haze and malaise of, gambling and drinking and all the things associated with it, and just sort of lose his soul without even knowing it. This is what liberalism does. It's the frog in the water mentality or principle, where you put the frog in the water and then you turn it on to boil. By the time he's dead, he doesn't even notice it got hot because it's slowly. If the water's already boiling, you put the frog in, he tries to get out right away. This is why Christ says, I'd rather you be hot or cold. Liberalism makes us warm, makes us lukewarm. Okay, so back to the book. That's the confusion of it. This is the spirit of Vatican II right here. To put oneself into harmony with the world. He says to excuse too much how well that is said, they want to excuse everything from the church's past, the Crusades, the Inquisition, etc. This is something we have seen in droves. I mean, if you grew up in Catholic school, you just basically try to explain these things away. They set out from a practical principle and from a fact that they judge to be undeniable. This principle is that the church would not know how to be understood in the concrete sphere, where it must accomplish its divine mission without putting itself into harmony with it. It is thus that later on the modernists will want to adapt the preaching of the gospel to the false critical science and to the false immanentist philosophy of the age, striving to render Christian faith accessible to minds trained to refuse the supernatural. Okay, a lot to unpack here. Let me just go back to this. So, in harmony with the world, they have this belief that the only way that the church can teach the ideal, which they say they believe in the kingship of Christ as an ideal, but the only way they can do that is if they go into the world and they look like everybody else and try to be like everybody else, and then people will accept them, and then they'll be ready to hear it. And then the same thing happens with modernism. Liberalism starts in the political and philosophical sphere, goes into the religious sphere as modernism. They're like two sides of the same coin, or one is the sort of daughter of the other, if that makes sense. And so basically, trying to gather my thoughts here. What happens is we go from this philosophy of we can't be too pushy in the state. And then because people's minds have been largely confused by the milieu of the modern education system, we then have to try to find a way to use the systems they were taught to think with to explain God. This is Catholic Answers. I don't mean to throw shade here. They're probably not going to hear this because this is just for the subscribers anyway. Trent Horn, those guys, God bless them. I'm not trying to start a war, but these guys are always dialoguing with atheists and things like that. And they're always trying to compliment the atheists on no, the atheists are dumb. Atheism is stupid. Atheism is wrong. It's wrong from the get-go. It's not one of the streams of truthiness in the world. No, it's wrong. And this is why they try to justify evolution in the strangest ways and so forth. And they just end up compromising on Catholic doctrine in order to be accepted by the non-Catholics. And this makes people very famous. You know, recently you have this recent series put out by Daily Wire. It's Ben Shapiro, Spencer Clavin, who is Andrew Clavin, one of the contributors. He's a gay with a surrogate child or whatever, and he's a conservative, so-called, and he's a Christian in a gay marriage with a surrogate child. Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Peugeot, who's an Orthodox Christian who focuses on symbolism and all that kind of stuff, and then Bishop Barron. Bishop Barron is on there. It's honestly like an Assisi meeting. It's the Jew, the atheist, the Jew, the evolutionist, the homo Protestant, the Orthodox, and the Catholic bishop walk into a bar. And it's super popular. Why? Because it requires nothing of anyone. It's intellectual titillation. It's spiritual professional wrestling. It's not real. It's entertaining. No one really gets hurt. No one really loses. And most importantly, no one wins. This is the extent of this liberalism and modernism, and it's infected Catholic apologetics. You know, one of our priests in Canada, Father McGillivray, he's one of our former priests in my priory. He's a good friend of the family, and he moved to, you might be listening to this, Father, if you're listening, hello. And he moved to Quebec to a different priory, and he was on this podcast with this atheist. And it was interesting because this podcast wanted to find a good old school Thomistic thinker, and someone recommended this SSPX priest. It was so funny to watch the conversation, so different than other conversations. Other conversations between these atheists and these Catholics, it's kind of like, oh, let's find our common ground. And Father McGillivray is a really charitable man, so obviously from the human perspective. But there was just this disconnect where they would be talking about things like substances and essences and the basic categories. And Father McGillivray was just like, no, that's the way it is. And the atheist was really stumped. And I think it was a very fruitful conversation because Father McGilvery just stuck to his guns and he says, no, this is how reality is ordered. These modern philosophical errors are insane. But you contrast that with one of these modern apologists and it's, well, we can just find the good and like the Darwinian idea of this. And like, really, that's an allegory. No, I'm sorry. It's stupid. All right, back to the book. And this is, so at the bottom of the page there, this is an interesting thing. So this is Archbishop Lefebvre referencing this phenomenon that happened like 100 years ago or so. And it was called worker priest. There was this thing in France called the Mission of France, and it held that numerous priests hold still today with regard the apostolate in the working world. So this was called worker priests. And this was the idea. If we want to convert them, we have to toil with the workers, not appear as priests, have their preoccupations, know their demands, and we will thus succeed in being the leaven in the dough. So the idea is that priests would take their cassocks off, put on the uniform, go and work in the factories and be amongst the common man. Pope Francis, right? Go to the peripheries, smell like the sheep. Well, they all lost their faith. And most of them lost their faith and they left the priesthood. Why? Because the priest must be set apart from the world as an example for us to leave it with him. It's the opposite of what the church's history shows us. This example that I use, and I think was my last, it was in an article I just wrote. I've talked about it before, but when you look at the great missionaries, meaning those who convert unconverted souls, you can be a missionary in a foreign land, you can be a missionary in your own land if it's in a state of apostasy. So I'll use two examples. The Canadian martyrs, North American martyrs. For about 10 years, Jean de Brébeuf and others, they toiled. And this is not to compare them to the worker priests. It wasn't the same. But what they did is they came over, they went and they lived in the longhouses, lived in the communities. You hear stories of them in these longhouses in the middle of the winter where and the reason they live in these big communal dwellings is to stay warm and things like that. They're smoky. There's no real ventilation. The children are naked running around. The people are half naked all the time. And the priests are just trying to learn the language. And they're like by the fireside saying their divine office when like dogs with fleas run by. Crazy suffering and stuff. Terrible food. And of course, they did not lose their faith because these were great saints. But their apostolate wasn't really that effective. They learned a lot, but it wasn't really that effective, actually. And they would write letters back to France. And then there was a new priest, I forget his name, but he was to come to Canada to be the superior of the mission in New France, in the Huron mission. Not too far from me, about 3.5 hours from me, actually, if I go a bit northeast. Anyway, he comes over, he has this vision, this dream of the priory. And they create this thing called St. Mary among the Hurons. It's a village. You can still go to the recreation and the site of it today. And they change things. And instead of living with the natives, they lived among the natives. Meaning they made a home, like a European-style dwelling, was made of timber and things like that, but there were rooms and study and chapel. Places to pray, places to be quiet, a kitchen, a dining area, where the priests would live in common and have their fraternal charity and their common life. They would feed their souls. They would achieve holiness by spending time in the front of the Blessed Sacrament and offering Mass. Because when they would go to these missions and live there, they couldn't really say Mass. They would go months without saying Mass. Can you imagine how hard that would be for a priest? It should be hard for a priest if he truly loves his vocation. And then they would go out together as priests, recharged in spurts with all the energy and vigor and confidence and holiness. And then they had success. And also, the native people, because they didn't live away from, they weren't like, we're 200 kilometers away. They were near them. Like there's the settlement of the natives along the lake or whatever. And then St. Mary among the Hurons is a stone's throw away, but it's its own place. It's its own house. It's different. The priests lived there. And it became attractive. And the natives realized that this was a place of God. The place of God is not the same thing as the place of toil in the dirt. And then they had massive conversions. Another example, and that's the opposite of the worker priest, right? Another example is Saint Jean Vianney. He's not really called a missionary by many, but in many ways he was. France was in a state of decay after the revolution. So yes, these villages were Catholic, but many people had stopped going to mass. So he gets sent to his small village for his first assignment, and no one goes to mass. Everyone's missing mass, and lots of immorality that was common in the village, the way they were spending their time. And you know how he got everyone to convert? He became as holy as he possibly could. He spent 8 hours a day kneeling in front of the Blessed Sacrament. He would sit in the confessional, even if nobody would come, and he would pray the rosary for the village the whole time. He would offer mass and do penance. And then little by little, people started coming. I mean, he talked to people as well. Obviously, he wasn't like a recluse, but it was the example of the holiness of the priest. The opposite of the worker priest. When you try to become like the world eats you up. When you separate yourself from the world comes to you. And this is the grave error of liberalism. It's a grave, grave misunderstanding. Back to the book. So here is one of the questioners in our chat was asking about the French Revolution. Well, here's some more examples of how Archbishop Lefebvre is tying these things in. As an aside, I've talked about this podcaster before, Daryl Cooper. He does these long podcast series on certain things, historical things, World War II, Jonestown, whatever, Zionism, like these big controversial things. I really love his style, and I do have a desire to do something similar with Catholic things. So I'm hold me to it, my friends. It'll take me months and months to do it, but I desire to put together almost like long, 3, 4, 5 hour podcasts, or even a series of 2 or 3 hours each, going through the lives of great saints like St. Thomas More, St. Edmund Campion, and, the French Revolution, things like that. I'd really like to put those things together for you guys. So pray for me that I can get that done. I'm finishing the charismatic book, and then I'll have more intellectual freedom. But I want to do something like that. It's going to take a lot of preparation, but I think you guys would really love that. And I think everyone would as well. Anyway, back to my thingy here. But in politics, liberal Catholics see in the principles of 1789, that's the French Revolution, Christian truths. Doubtless a little bit dissolute, but once purified, the modern ideals are on the whole assimilable by the church. Liberty, equality, fraternity, democracy, ideology, and pluralism. This is the error that Pius IX condemns in the syllabus. The error is that the Roman pontiff can and should be reconciled and come to terms with progress, liberalism, and modern civilization. Liberalism is 1789. Liberalism is the French Revolution. Last page here. In all this so-called Catholic liberalism, there is a lack of faith, or more precisely, a lack of the spirit of faith, which is a spirit of loyalty to submit all to Jesus Christ. It's cowardice. Goodness gracious. Years ago, Bishop Barron was on. Well, I don't mean to just pick on Bishop Barron, but I remember I was told once to read. Someone wanted to do this like book study with me. Doesn't matter who. Total personal life thing, nothing to do with any podcasters or anything. And he wanted to discuss my traditionalism. And he wanted me to read an encyclical from Pius XI and then read one from Benedict XVI, and we could compare them. And I remember reading the one from Pius XI and then reading the one from Benedict XVI. And I was like, Pope Benedict, can you please just make a point? And Pope Benedict's seen as the more surgically and reasonable one than John Paul II, who was more ethereal, and Pope Francis, who the heck knows what he's saying. But even Benedict, compared to Pius XI, not even close. Not even close. They just don't get to the point. They just don't say the truth without compromise. It's really frustrating. Liberalism. This is back to the book, all of liberal Catholicism, says Cardinal Below, is self-contained in a maintained ambiguity, the confusion between tolerance and approval. And I wrote a little note here, accept me. The confusion between tolerance and approval. That's it right there. Tolerance and approval. We tolerate things, we don't approve of them. The liberal says tolerating them does mean that we approve of them. No, we don't. And this is a quote here from Dom Garanger. Today, more than ever, society needs doctrines that are strong and consistent with one another. In the midst of the general dissolution of ideas, only an affirmation, a firm, well-founded, uncompromising affirmation will be able to make itself accepted. Transactions become more and more fruitless, and each one of them carries away a shred of the truth. Show yourselves, therefore, to be such as you are in reality. Convinced Catholics, there is a grace attached to the full and entire confession of the faith. This confession, the apostle tells us, is the salvation of those who make it, and experience demonstrates that it is also the salvation of those who hear it. That is it in a nutshell. You tell the truth in season and out of season, without compromise, without ambiguity, stamped it, locked it, can't erase it. Two things will happen. You'll be accepted or you'll be rejected. If you're accepted, it's because they convert. If you're rejected, it's because they don't convert and they kill you or you have to leave. In both cases, you're saved. If you're accepted, you're a great missionary. You're a great evangelist. And it's a wonderful thing. If you're rejected and you're martyred, you go to heaven. And in many cases, they accept it. So it's a win-win-win. Liberalism is just not that. It's just confused. Okay, last thing here. There's just two longer quotes from the popes. I'll bring these up. And this is, they're just two longer quotes. I just want to read them just to hammer home, and then we'll be done for the day. This is from chapter 17 of the book, The Popes and Liberal Catholicism. Because we talked about the popes and liberalism, but this is the popes and liberal Catholicism, okay? This is more specific. So this is Pius IX. And I'll read this for you here. And he is writing about what's happening in France. What afflicts your country and prevents it from meriting the blessings of God is the mixture of principles. I will say the word, and I will not keep it secret. What I fear is not all those wretches from the Paris Commune. What I fear is this unhappy politics, this Catholic liberalism, which is a veritable scourge. This seesaw game which would destroy religion. Without doubt, one must practice charity, do what is possible to bring back those who have lost their way. It is not, however, necessary for that to share their opinions. Therefore, venerable brother, the Bishop of Quimper, notify the members of the Catholic Association that on the numerous occasions when we have reproved the partisans of liberal opinions, we have not had in view those who hate the Church and whom it would be useless to name, but rather those whom we have just indicated, who, preserving and supporting the hidden virus of the liberal principles that they have absorbed with milk, under the pretext that is not contaminated with an evident malice, and that it is not contaminated with an evident malice and is not, according to them, detrimental to religion, easily infect the minds and thus propagate the seeds of those revolutions from which the world has been shaking for a long time. Nevertheless, and although the children of the world are more clever than the children of light, their ruses, of the enemies of the Church, would doubtless have less success if a great number among those who carry the name of Catholic did not extend to them a friendly hand. I'm going to pause there for a sec. The Pope is saying, do not extend a friendly hand. Do not try to meet them where they're at when they are explicit enemies of the Church. Yes, alas, there are those who seem to want to walk in agreement with our enemies and do their best to establish an alliance between the light and the darkness, an accord between justice and iniquity, by means of those doctrines that are called liberal Catholic, which, resting on the most pernicious principles, flatter the secular power when it invades spiritual things and impel minds to respect or at least to tolerance of the most iniquitous laws, absolutely as if it were not written that one can serve two masters. Now these are assuredly more dangerous and more deadly than declared enemies. Isn't that amazing? He's saying this tolerance of things mixing it with Catholicism is worse than straight out anti-Catholicism, both because they further their efforts without being noticed, perhaps without suspecting it, and because living on the edge of formally condemned opinions, they give themselves a certain appearance of integrity and of irreproachable doctrine, thus alluring the imprudent lovers of conciliation and deceiving the honest people, who would revolt against a declared error. In this way, they divide the minds, tear up unity, and weaken the forces that must be reunited in order to turn them all together against the enemy. We can do nothing but approve of your having undertaken to defend and to explain the decisions of our syllabus, especially those which condemn the so-called Catholic liberalism, which, counting a great number of adherents among upright men themselves and seeming to deviate less from the truth, is more dangerous for the others, more easily deceives those who do not keep themselves on their guard, and destroying the Catholic spirit imperceptibly and in a hidden manner diminishes the forces of the Catholics and increases those of the enemy. I'll read the next quote here in a second, but you know what he's talking about there, to put it in layman's terms, or in modern terms, or our terms? The hardest person to talk about Catholicism with is a lapsed Catholic who went to Catholic school. Because they understand Catholicism, right? They went to Catholic school. They were raised Catholic. No, they were raised as liberal Catholics. It's much easier to talk to a stranger about Catholicism, someone who's never been catechized, than to somebody who's been poisoned by false pseudo-Catholic doctrines. That's the point he's trying to make. This gives the enemy enemies within the church. It would be better, it's kind of like, I'll use an example from World War I. The Russian military, I think they had something like 1 million soldiers or something, but they didn't even have enough bullets. Like, it was a disaster at the beginning. So they could easily be defeated by the Austrians on the Eastern Front, even though their military was much stronger. The point is, you'd rather have a small, trim fighting force than one filled with soldiers who can't do anything. And they're actually more of a detriment to you than having a smaller military. We'd be better off having less prelates who are more orthodox than a bunch of wishy-washy ones going around. Back to the book here. Last quote. And this is from a book commenting on it. What is then this transaction which has been pursued for long years, and which is formulated today in a manner more and more urgent? What place do they want to give to the church in an edifice from which it was first to be excluded? Liberals and governors accept it willingly as an auxiliary. Their full independence, their sovereignty without limit, and their entire liberty of action are reserved outside it and its authority. They give up to it the realm of consciences, provided that on its side it leave politics to them and recognize the social efficacy of the modern ideas known by the name of principles of 1789. Captured by this seductive snare, many generous spirits do not understand that these principles, so moderate, can be rejected. Some go away from the church imagining absurdly that it really demands the sacrifice of progress and of liberty. Certain others, on the contrary, not daring to deny the virtue of the modern formulas, make laborious efforts to persuade the church to accept, like them, the reconciliation that is offered to it. By dint of goodwill, they believe it proven to them that, some nuances aside, the principles of 1789 are pure Christian principles, and that it would be artful to take possession of them and to bring them gradually and smoothly to be recognized and blessed by the Holy See. Archbishop Lefebvre says, that's it. That is exactly what took place at the time of Vatican II. The liberals succeeded in having the principles of 1789 blessed by the Pope and by the Council. And I will attempt to show you this later, he writes. This is why there can be no compromise with modernism. There can't. There can be charity showed to modernists. There can be no charity showed to modernism. This is why Archbishop Lefebvre would say, The situation of the Society of St. Pius X would be quote unquote regular when the church returns to tradition, because it's not about the SSPX, it's about tradition. As long as there is poison in the ointment, you can't use it, even if there's lots of good in it. As long as there's liberalism in the doctrine, you can't use that book for your kids because that infection's still there. But this is lost, and Archbishop Lefebvre says this is the Second Vatican Council, and we'll see that as we go, and we'll talk about that at length. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to sign off here. Last thing, there are a couple spots left for my Italy trip, which is in 2 months. If you want to take a last-minute trip to Italy, check out the link in the description area for this podcast, and the information is there. All right, my friends, I will talk to you soon. God bless you all. This has been Mere Tradition, another book study, and I'll see you next time.